Hey, what is up, everybody? Hope you had a good weekend. I have a main topic that I want to talk about today, and that's what you clicked on this video for. But I did want to spend about 30 to 60 seconds talking about something secondary, primarily because a lot of people were asking about this. But apparently I have a lot of viewers who are from Germany who are asking me to make a similar type of video about the Switch 2 sales in Germany, similar to the ones I made about Spain, France, and UK in particular. So I can't go into too much detail about it because there's really only two pieces of data. In 2017, the Nintendo Switch managed to sell 600,000 units in Germany. That's basically the only bit of data that we have for Germany regarding the Switch in its first year. Presumably, it's the same story as the rest of Europe. Supply constraint issues through most of that first year, with a huge bump coming in the holidays, that being the largest amount of units that they sold, and then momentum would continue on into the following year. And then by the end of the Switch's lifetime in Germany, it's fairly successful. The Switch 2 in 2025 doesn't have an exact number, but we know that Mario Kart World has 600,000 units sold, so you're probably looking at 700,000, maybe even 750,000, depending on how many non-bundles were sold. So if we're being generous, we'll say the Switch 2 is probably about 15% ahead of the Switch 1 in their first years, specifically in Germany, and I'm probably rounding up by at least 5 or 6% right now. But if you look at the worldwide patterns, the same rules here will apply. It was probably at least double what the Switch 1 sold on its launch weekend. They effectively had zero supply constraint issues with the Switch 2. There were actual marketed price drops and discounts that were advertised in Germany. I've shared links of those on my channel in the past, specifically for the Switch 2, but not for the Switch 1, and presumably that happens because of slow sales. And then now, going into 2026, my assumptions at least, and this is going to be my assumption with every location, except maybe Japan, is that the Switch 2 is going to see a huge slowdown over the next few months, whereas back in 2018, the Switch 1, the momentum started to rise up beyond that first year. So I don't know if we're going to get any German data anytime soon. I don't know how much German data was shared about the Switch 1 even, to be honest. But at the very least, we know that it has similar patterns to the UK, to Spain, and to France to an extent. And even with the States, where the launch showed the Switch 2 significantly ahead of the Switch 1, and by the end of that 2017/2025, the gap is much smaller, and realistically, if you continue moving forward and nothing changes, it's going to change and the Switch 1's going to be in the lead. But yeah, that's all I got. Let's go to actual topic of this video. So a few months ago, I believe it was prior to the launch of the actual Switch 2 console, I had made a series of videos talking about how gaming today is much more expensive than it ever was in the past. The reason I had made those videos is because the argument that I had made at the time was that Nintendo launching the Switch 2 at the price that it's at in this current economy was absolutely downright idiotic of them, because the people just realistically cannot afford to spend that kind of money on a Nintendo console, right? Because Nintendo consoles, we know this, they're usually the budget option. And I was met with a crazy amount of pushback for believing this. People were sharing articles by IGN, who were like putting clippings of magazines from the 90s, being so willfully incorrect and arrogant in their assessment while arguing against me, and suggesting that, well, actually, Dean, if you were to adjust for inflation, the Switch 2 is actually a great price. By the way, that's like the default voice in my head when somebody comes to my channel and argues against me. This is how I assume every one of you guys sound. Anyway, so I took that to heart. I'm like, there's a lot of things you can tell me about the Nintendo Switch 2. One thing you cannot tell me for certain is that gaming now is not more expensive than it was in the past. Because while these people were all accounting for inflation in their discussions against me, they weren't really considering purchasing power of every individual. And not only that, they weren't considering the fact that consoles do not get price drops, they weren't considering the fact that the rental market was phenomenal, all of the updates, DLC, online payments, all the different stuff that we have to pay extra for while we're not even realizing it sometimes. They didn't account for any of this. I had one person who straight up came to my channel and it was like, "Yo, in 1995, I paid $399 for a Sega Saturn. That's like $850 today. The Switch 2 is a great deal and will be just fine." And so I made the argument, both in my comments as well as like in my follow-up videos about the topic, that if you were to buy a game on its launch day, in its first month, back in the day versus right now, then even when you account for purchasing power, yeah, probably it was more expensive back then depending on the console and the year that you bought it. But the people that were buying these game consoles, a vast majority of them bought them after the price drops. The amount of early adopters that were buying games prior to the price drop was significantly lower because many of these consoles went down in price very quickly within the first year or two. Actually, I'll just share the spreadsheet that I have from that video right on screen right now. This spreadsheet was basically the whole video. This is how much the console launches at, how much it goes down in price, how that relates to like like the modern day consoles, effectively what it would cost if you were to buy a console a year after launch, 2 years after launch, 3 years after launch, etc. Whereas in today's day and age, the consoles do not go down in price. And this is a precedent that has been set by Nintendo. They started it with the Nintendo Switch 1. They're the first console to not drop in price. And not only do they not drop in price, they don't offer the same discounts. So for example, the PS5, like right now, everybody's like, oh, it went up in price. Go online anywhere. You can buy the disc PS5 for cheaper than it was at launch. It's like $450 at most retailers in the US. Even in Europe, part of the reason that it had such a good holiday season was because they dropped it back to below the launch price, I believe, in some nations. And up until a few months ago, the Xbox Series X was less than $500. They only recently increased the price for it. And really, they increased the price for it because they're effectively done selling them. I think they don't care if they make any more sales or not. They'll just do minor discounts, but they're not going to take losses on it anymore. But both the Series X and the Series S were getting discounts over the past 4 years. Same with the PS5, everything except for the Nintendo consoles. And even with the Switch 2 right now, Nintendo didn't even give it the freaking discount. It was the retailers who were like, nobody's buying this in the holidays and we got to find a way to get them in the store. Now, mind you, in those videos, I cross-referenced the data. I actually checked how many people bought each console at the launch price versus the post-discount / price drop price. And the amount of people that were actually buying these games, not just at launch, but in that first, 6 months to a year, however long they stayed at the highest price they had, because they used to drop pretty quickly. The amount of people that were doing that at every single console was very minimal. I'm serious. Check out these videos if you get a chance. They're well worth your time. But that's just the reality. The vast majority of people that were going to buy games didn't buy them at that launch price because the price went down very quickly. So even if you were to account for games, for example, being more expensive today than they were back then, the consoles were so much cheaper that there is almost no way in hell that you were paying more money back then than you are now. And the games also dropped down in price very quickly. It's not like right now with Nintendo where they're charging more for Breath of the Wild than they were back when the Switch 1 launched. That's a Wii U game, need I remind you. But the amount of pushback I got from that video for so many people who are arguing against this fact, read the comments. It is hilarious. You might even find a few in there of people coming in after like the Switch 2 started launching and getting sales where they were coming in and be like, well, this didn't age well. Obviously the price was set fine. Because there was just so much confidence and so much arrogance with these people with the assumption that the Switch 2 was priced perfectly, especially in this economy, and the economy was healthy enough for games, and video games were recession-proof, and there was not going to be any issues with the Nintendo Switch 2, and Nintendo gave them the exact right price, and it's actually not that much more expensive, and everyone's just being a brokey. Also that they can turn back around to us in December and until now, and start talking about how the Switch 2 is not doing well because of the economy. So I am here to give all of you a chance that disagreed with me back then to tell me I was right back then. Right? That was my argument back then. That in this economy, the Switch 2 would suffer, it would struggle, and it would have a hard time moving units in its first year, especially in the holiday after you get through all of the people that have to buy it at launch. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now. So if you're not going to admit that I was right about the Switch 2 having a failed first year because of how slowly consoles have been moving ever since that first month and a half, at least admit that I was absolutely right. Gaming today is more expensive than it's ever been in the past. Because even back in 2008 to 2012, when the economy was absolutely terrible, sales didn't struggle. So I guess the economy was fine back then because the consoles were still moving forward. So if it's not that, then it must be the fact that video games today are overpriced and more expensive than they were back then. Why do you think the PlayStation 5 had a slower year this year, even though it completely destroyed the Switch 2 and everywhere except for Japan where the Switch 2 is subsidized? Why do you think the PlayStation 5 has had such a drop-off and such a slowdown? It all comes back to those videos I made prior to the launch of the Switch 2, when I said very clearly, and I showed you guys the data and the numbers and the dates, that gaming today is much more expensive because there was no way in hell back then that anybody would pay full price for a PlayStation console 5 or 6 years after it launched. And likewise with a Nintendo console and a Sega console. And likewise, as we saw back then, the family-friendly Nintendo console that goes head-to-head with the PlayStation console at the exact same price also struggled while they were both at the same price. Now, in fairness, back in the 90s, the Nintendo console was not budget by any means. They had the power. It was stronger than the PlayStation 1 even. But it's very interesting to see that for the first time since the 90s, it's been 30 years, that Nintendo decides to price itself head-to-head against Sony, and it immediately gets obliterated when it goes into Sony's zone. So when they're coming in 2025, and now in 2026, and they're charging the Sony price for their console, they can't be surprised that they struggled in the holidays. The consoles are too expensive. A PlayStation console should not be the same price as it was at launch 5 years later, and a Nintendo console should not have the same launch price as a Sony console. These are the facts of life. These are counter to the success of these consoles. The difference between the PS5 and the Nintendo Switch 2, however, is that Sony, they already built up their user base on the PlayStation 5. They could just chill and do nothing now and just sell their games and get their PS Plus subscribers to give them more money every month. But Nintendo cannot do that. And it is Nintendo's job to find the right price to deliver to their customers during the economy when they want to make the money. But one thing is for certain is that what they're charging for the Nintendo Switch 2 is too expensive, because gaming today has become too expensive as a whole. It's not just a Nintendo thing, it's across the board. They don't follow the same patterns that they used to follow. They don't offer the lower prices that they used to offer. And the discounts and price drops are just so much more stingy and spread apart than they used to be. And this past holiday season, if nothing else, has completely proved that I was right when I said that the Nintendo Switch 2 and gaming as a whole right now is way more expensive than it was back in the day, because as we have seen and was pointed to us by the Circana folks, the Black Friday sales were the worst since 1995. In 1995, the Sega Genesis and the SNES were on their way out. The PS1 launched at too expensive of a price, so it was still kind of getting into that slow start where it would get its price drop in the following year with the launch of the Nintendo 64. All the while, Sega was busy tying a bunch of cinder blocks around their ankles and jumping into a lake. Meanwhile, in 2025, the PS5 had been out like for 5 or 6 years, just like the SNES had been. The Nintendo Switch 2 was recently launched at too high of a price. And the Xbox is the one that's now looking for a way to swim with the fishes. History sometimes doesn't automatically repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And back when these low sales happened in 1995, it was not the end of the gaming industry. It actually wasn't even a concern for most people. Because back then, everybody knew that if you just gave it a year or two, sometimes even 6 months, the consoles and the game prices were going to go down, the sales numbers were going to go up, and most people were not foolishly wasting their money on things because the purchase power was much better back then, making gaming a significantly more affordable hobby back in the day than it is now. And I'm glad that all of those that are white knighting for the Nintendo Switch 2 are finally in agreement with me about this, because all of the arguments and the copium that they've been spreading around in defense of Nintendo's failure this past holiday season, specifically when talking about the economy, is basically everything that I was saying prior to the launch of the Switch 2. Anyway, that's all I got for tonight. Thank you so much for listening, and I will catch you on the next one.